Good evening. I'm Mike Rippey, pastor of Evangel Church, and you have come across the Fire Bible. We're starting a brand new study. Why don't you stick with me for the next 25 or 30 minutes? We're going to look into the life of one of the most well-known, controversial, beloved figures in all of human history that comes from the Scripture. David, the shepherd boy. David, the great king. David, the warrior. David, married quite a few. David, maybe not that great a father. David, a man after God's own heart. So stay with us. Let me give you a little heads up, too. This is going to be about a 4-week teaching series. And then, for those of you that are part of the Evangel family, I'm going to begin what will be one of the most important Bible studies that I have ever done for this church family. It's going to be on the book of Acts. It's going to start Wednesday evening, September 28th, which will coincide with what is inside the church, a relaunch, a catalyst point for us as we introduce the Acts 2 vision for Evangel Church. Mark that date down, both September 25th, a Sunday, September 28th, a Wednesday night, and then, of course, you can watch that I'm presenting on Wednesday night at your own time. Here's what I'm going to be asking, is that every person that's a part of Evangel, even if you're part of other life groups, would you, as we study the book of Acts, give me about 25 minutes a week where our entire church can go through that book together? I know that you will. So, that's going to be in a few weeks. This evening, this morning, whenever you're watching, King David. 1 Samuel chapter 13, and I'm in your notes, and if you don't have notes, contact the church. We can get them to you. And if you attend Evangel, they're out at Connection Corner, and they've been out there. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people. And that would be David. Tonight, I'm going to give you the syllabus. There's only a few fill-ins, but there's a lot of information here because I want to give the backdrop that leads up to David. So we're going to take this short series on the life of King David, and we find out about his life, and I give you the scripture here, his biography in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, all the way through 1 Kings chapter number 2 and verse 11. Now, David was many, many things to many different people. Some just know him as that shepherd boy that killed the giant. A lot of people know that story. Others know that he was a great musician and songwriter. I mean, he was the Paul McCartney of his day. Well over 150 psalms, almost all of them in the scriptures that he wrote, plus a lot that didn't make the cut, so to speak. He was a great statesman. He was a husband. Write that in your notes. He was a husband, and then I put next to it in your notes, of 8 women. No wonder Solomon got into so much trouble with so many wives. He followed after Dad, and what Dad did in moderates, he did in extremes. And a father. So he was a husband and a father. But I want you to notice this. He was a husband of 8 and a father of sorts. We're going to talk about that. Scripture is very honest. David was not a good father. He was passive. He wasn't involved in his kids' lives. We'll get to that. And he was a king for 40 years. David ruled the kingdom of Israel. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Then David rested with his fathers. This is the end of that biography, as I mentioned in Scripture. Was buried in the city of David. That's what it's called even by some today, which is Jerusalem. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 in Jerusalem. We're actually going to talk about that. A lot of people don't realize that. Now, what's interesting is the reign of King David and that of his son and successor Solomon lasted for a total of 80 years. 2 great leaders, and the kings of Israel, which were actually the second and third, which we'll deal with the first in just a moment. David from 1010 BC to 970 BC, and Solomon from 970 to 930 BC. These 80 years have been called, write this in your notes, the golden age of Israel. The golden age of Israel. Militarily, never as powerful. Centerpiece of the world stage, never as much as it was during those years. In all areas of measuring, if you would, the kingdom, it was the golden age of Israel. So let's dig back into the historic background and bring you up to that point. Nearly 1,700 years before Christ, Joseph, going back now to the book of Genesis, brought his father Jacob and the entire family to Egypt. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers and now has become second in charge of all of the nation of Egypt. And he was honored and given land, and this would be for him and his family in that fertile delta of the Nile Valley there by Pharaoh. For a few hundred years, the Jews prospered in the land of the pyramids. Then the Egyptians rebelled against the foreign dynasty. I don't have time to go into that, but those pharaohs that were on the throne when Joseph came down, we're talking about David, but when Joseph came down, were not Egyptians. And of course, the Egyptians bristled under that. During that time of what would be foreign leaders over Egypt, Joseph and his family, the Jewish nation, did well. But then there was this rebellion throughout those leaders that were not truly Egyptians and put an Egyptian dynasty in their place. And they rebelled against them. And that's where it says in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, then a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. History lines up with it. Scripture lines up with it. That's exactly what happened. This new Pharaoh considered the Jews to be a threat and attempted the world's first genocide against the Jews. So, God raised up, put this name in your notes. You'll know him, you'll love him, from Israeli history, Moses, to deliver them out of Egypt. Moses led them for a 40-year period to the very threshold of the promised land of Israel. And there on Mount Nebo, Moses died, and he was buried by God. Having a little problem speaking English tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. He lived under the favor of the Lord to the very end of his life. About the year 1410 BC, Joshua, you know that name, write it in your outline there. Joshua, Moses' successor, led the Jews into, and write this down, the promised land. The promised land. So now the Jews are coming back into that promised land. They are a great nation now, having been in Egypt part of the time prospering, part of the time as slaves, multiplying the entire time. They came down as a group of about 70 and an extended family of Jacob, and now they are a great and mighty nation, leaving Egypt and coming into the promised land. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the great sea on the west. Time out for just a moment. Israel never possessed all that land. God said you could and you would, but they never did. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Sounds like the words we hear in the New Testament. The book of Joshua, in your notes, is a triumphant book. It's a triumphant book. With the Jews conquering the promised land of Israel, the book covers some 20 to 25 years of Jewish history. But it ends sadly. Joshua chapter 24, after these things, Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath Sarah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaius. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done. Those happy times were over for nearly 40 years, because the next book of the Bible is Judges, and it tells the sad story, put this in your notes, of 7 cycles of victory and defeat. Israel has no real leader. You say, Pastor Michael, why are we taking all this time? I want you to see the reason and the setup for David becoming the second king of Israel. And so they had these 7 cycles in the book of Judges. Matter of fact, the scripture in Judges says every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Famous refrain from the book of Judges, which sounds a lot like the United States today. Just going to leave it there. Time and again, that little bullet there in your notes, the people of Israel were conquered, write that word in, by invading foreigners or the Philistines who dwelt on the western coast of ancient Palestine. Sad. Very sad. They didn't take all the possession and the promises they had, and they kept being defeated time and time again by different enemies in their life. I don't have time to preach that, but that ought to preach to you. If you don't take all that God has for you, possess everything that he has for you, if you fall short of that, if you begin to let idols, into your heart and land, if you would, different things are going to defeat you. You'll go through a cycle yourself. I hope America doesn't do that, but I hope more than that, you don't do that. The Philistines had invaded the land about the same time Moses led the Jews out of Egypt. So they're coming into this land about the same time. The Philistines came from the Mediterranean island of Crete, forced off their island when Santorin erupted, the violent volcanic explosion. So there's this violent, they were an island people, and this violent volcano erupts. And so they head from the island to the coast of Palestine, which would be now Israel. And so they're coming there onto the coast about the same time the Israelis are coming up from Egypt. If this is the coast, they're coming from an island to the coast. That's the Philistine. Children of Israel coming up. So there's these 2 nations that are going to be fighting it out pretty much over much of the same land. They made their way to Palestine, or Canaan, back in your notes, as it was also called, and settled there with their chief 5 cities. Here are the chief 5 cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Circle the word Gath. Who's the most famous citizen from Gath? Give you a moment to ponder. Do you remember? Write it in your notes. The giant Goliath. We're going to come to him in this study. All right, next paragraph. It was during this time of the Judges, we're living in the time of Judges, the book of Judges, those 7 cycles, that the story of Ruth unfolded. Born in Moab to the southwest of the Dead Sea, Ruth came to Israel along with her also recently widowed mother-in-law, Naomi. While working in a field, Ruth met the owner, a man named Boaz. Pastor, why are you telling all this? Watch all these threads come together. We're going to see why there's a king. There's 7 horrible cycles with no leader, and the people not following God. That's what he always wanted. So we see that thread coming together. We see the Philistines, from which will come Goliath. Oh, that string's going to lead to David. Now, Ruth, we're tying together that time period of the book of Judges. Ruth met the owner named Boaz, fell in love with her. He fell in love with her. They were married, and we find their genealogy in Matthew. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of, Jesse. You see the string coming together? Who is Jesse? The father of King David. Now, I put in your notes, it's traditionally accepted by many, including myself, that Solomon was one of those two spies. Remember when Joshua sent the two spies into the land to spy it out? He actually sent 12, but 2 came back with a good report. One being Joshua, who becomes the next leader, and then Solomon, we believe, was that other one that was sent in. That both of these stayed in Rahab's home. Remember, they told her, you're going to be saved when our people come in. Put that scarlet thread, that scarlet curtain. You see a lot of threads and pictures and this mosaic coming together. Rahab was the town madam at that time, which shows us God can use anybody. And all these people become ancestors of the subject that we're studying, King David. Now, near the end of the time of the judges, a great man is born. So we're moving the story ahead quickly in this teaching. The prophet and priest Samuel. Samuel. Another thread. Notice it. 1 Samuel 7. Samuel continued as judge over Israel all the days of his life. From year to year he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also judged Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So the question was, who would succeed the mighty Samuel? He's the final judge, priest, prophet, if you would. This is a good man. No one like him. His sons certainly couldn't do that. His sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So it wasn't going to be them. So the rulers of the tribes of Israel came to Samuel with a brazen request. Because remember, God always wanted to be the God of Israel and the leader of Israel. So 1 Samuel chapter 8. All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you're old. Your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. That's 7 cycles of rebellion and disobedience and idol worship, and then revival and renewal and blessing, and then finding themselves in prosperity, they would begin to go into areas of idolatry. It's just a cycle. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. God always wanted to be their king. Paul makes it clear that all Scripture is inspired of the Lord, and it's useful for teaching and rebuking and correcting and training in righteousness. But it's also true that God uses human vessels to write his word. Each of the some 40 writers of Scripture, over about 1,500, showed their personalities. And Samuel's not an exception. It's obvious, I believe, and I want you to put this in your notes, to the objective student of Scripture that Samuel did not particularly like Saul. Write that in your notes. We can't imagine that, but it's true. It's true. God commanded Samuel to anoint Saul of the little tiny tribe of Benjamin as the new and first king of Israel. Remember, this would end Samuel's predominance over the nation. So maybe on just a personal level, maybe he didn't like Saul. Saul was strong and handsome and tall. And he didn't like him. And I think it's pretty clear in that regard. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people of Israel. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked upon my people, for their cry has reached me. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about. He'll govern my people. So Saul was anointed the very first king over Israel. You have to wonder how Samuel felt about this man. So all the people went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. So let's look at Saul just very quickly. Gilgal was an area near the Jordan River, not far from Jericho. So, King Saul, there's been few men in history that have ever been given such a great opportunity. I'm in your notes now to count for God as was King Saul. Write this in your notes though. Few men have failed in so many opportunities. First king, anointed, all the favor and goodness of God. I don't have time in these moments of study tonight to go into all these failures. Just realize they were great. Next paragraph, and I want you to write this down. 1 Samuel 15 tells us the sad story of God's withdrawal from Saul's life. And you can read about that in 1 Samuel 15 and verse 9 there. When Samuel burst into the presence of the disobedient king, his pronouncement spelled the end to Saul's reign. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's why the kingdom wasn't passed down to Saul's son. Interestingly enough, Saul was a great father. Had a son that probably could have been a great king. So Saul lost even that ability to have a legacy of a family that sat on the throne of Israel. Could you even go to the point to say the Messiah might have come from his inheritance had he not been so disobedient? So here's the words. The Lord said, 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 1, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Because Saul got killed in battle along with his son. And Samuel reverenced the king over the nation of Israel. God said, I've rejected him. Let's move on. Jesse had 8 sons. First bullet there. After they appeared to Samuel one by one, the prophet was perplexed because none of these was, write this in your notes, God's choice. God's choice. He asked Jesse, speaking of Samuel, if he had any other sons, and was then told of David. And you can read that with me. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen any of these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he's tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. There's an interesting little catch there. He didn't want to be sitting down when the king walked in the room. Just in case the Lord said, this is the one. Because you know before a king walks in, they say, hey, King George is walking in the room. Everybody up. And they stand up before the king walks in. Queen Elizabeth is coming. Stand up. Well, could it be? And none of those brothers, and even Jesse was going to say, well, here's your king. Stand up. So we're not going to sit down. I want to make sure. So he sent in, he had him brought in. He was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. He is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. At God's timing, the fugitive years. Now, I misspoke when I said that God had told Samuel to stop the mourning because the king's dead. The king wasn't dead at that point. My bad. Because the king's going to live on forever, but the Lord had rejected him. Now, so David becomes fugitive. We're going to deal with this in greater detail next week. David's chosen by God and anointed by Samuel to be Israel's king, but he would rule for 40 years, but not for quite a while. Years would go by with Saul on his heels, trying to assassinate David. And even after Saul's death, David didn't become king over all of the land. There was a struggle, as you could just imagine in the natural. Okay, Saul's dead, his boy's dead. We've heard that the lineage isn't going to stay. There were some other powerful leaders in different places around the nation of Israel, probably trying to put their finger in the air and see if the wind blew their way. Maybe they were to be king. So it took a while. And it was only a small portion of the nation. Remember, I told you that for 7 years he ruled from Hebron, and then 33 from Jerusalem. We'll go through all that next year. God's, write this in your notes, timing is something we have to learn in our life. Now, it's interesting, before he becomes king, because he's already been anointed, he faces a giant. Sometimes before you take that next great step in the Lord, as we'll see with David, you're going to face some incredible giants. Have faith and be victorious. Oh, we've just laid a big picture, but you see all the strings coming together into David's life. Those cords, those scarlet cords, that lead all the way to Jesus, that lead all the way to you and to me. That's the power and majesty of the story of David. Next week, David and the giant and the early years in David's leadership as king. Can't wait to share that lesson with you. If you like this, share it with somebody. Like it on YouTube. Like it on Facebook. Be back with me next time we meet. Wednesday nights, 6:30. See you then.